Hello and welcome to The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira, on Rajya Sabha Television. India and Japan today signed a landmark nuclear energy pact after 6 years of negotiations between the two countries. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is on a 3-day visit to Japan, his second in 2 years, as China's influence grows in the region. The visit is also significant in the present international scenario. On this edition of The Big Picture, we'll take a look at relations between the two countries and the crucial aspects of this visit. Joining me on the program today are former diplomat Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, senior journalist Prem Shankar Jha. Also with me on the program, Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar, Director, Society for Policy Studies, and B.R. Deepak, Professor, Center of Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, JNU. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to start with you, of course, first. The civil nuclear deal, talks have been going on for the last 6 years, has finally been signed. It's a landmark agreement.
Well, it is extremely important. Things like the word landmark and strategic and so on, I find are very much overused. But certainly it's an important agreement. If you remember, after our nuclear tests, nuclear weapons tests in 1998, one of the countries that was most critical of that move was Japan. Japan is the one country in the world that has actually suffered under nuclear weapons dropped on their cities. And they were, at that time, extremely critical of India and very, very vocal in their statements about it being essential that India joins the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is an objection they carried on for some time. I think we were right not to overreact, but to use persuasion and concentrate on talking to Japan about our track record and our very responsible attitude towards our fledgling nuclear arsenal. And the fact that this nuclear deal for peaceful use of nuclear energy has been signed, I think is an indicator of what has been going on for the last few years, which is a very, very significant warming up of Indo-Japan relations, not just in the usual friendly relation sense, but with a strategic component that actually for once justifies that word. It has a security content. It has a very solid mutually beneficial content. If you look at the geopolitics of the world today, the problems we have with the foreign policy challenge we have vis-a-vis China, and the need, therefore, to put it bluntly, to develop extremely close relationships with those who may be on our side when the need is there, which is why I think Prime Minister Modi is quite right in giving this priority to Indo-Japan relations. His second visit in 2 years. He and Shinzo Abe seem to be getting along very well. So the nuclear deal, I think, is an important one, but underlines a whole lot of other things that have been going on, which are, I think, very positive in Indo-Japan relations and bode well for India.
Commodore, there were apprehensions in Tokyo because, of what happened in Fukushima in 2011, and also India is not part of the NPT. But in spite of that, the deal has come through now and the deal has been signed. What do we look forward to as far as this civil nuclear deal is concerned?
I'd just like to add to what Ambassador Mukherjee has said, that as far as the bilateral is concerned, Frank, I think the fact that Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe could close the civilian nuclear agreement, which has been in the pipeline for almost a decade, to me is symbolically very significant. This was in many ways a constraint, meaning the nuclear issue was preventing India and Japan from engaging in a more robust and wide spectrum manner. With this particular agreement having been reached or concluded at the political level, because I foresee that when it now moves into the techno-commercial domain, meaning Indian entities like our nuclear power corporation has to engage with Japanese entities, I'm sure the insurance issue and the techno-commercial clauses there and the financial implications will be negotiated very carefully and slowly by both sides, which I think is expected. But more importantly, as I said, it removes a constraint, both substantively and symbolically. And I presume that Prime Minister Abe himself would be reviewing the Japanese constitutional provisions so that India and Japan could really now move on other tracks.
Indeed.
And I think that is the direction that I foresee, that for India and Japan, if we talk about an Asian century, a robust engagement, I would say, is very, very imperative. Not so much because it is being seen as quote unquote anti-China, but a robust India-Japan partnership relationship across the board, political, economic, technology, etc., would in a way punctuate the Asian grid in such a way that engaging China perhaps would give us a greater degree of malleability. And I think that is the sense that I get from the way in which Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi are engaging. Because look at the Japanese example. Japan has very strong reservations on the strategic and security front with China, but that has not prevented Japan from engaging with China for the last 30 years.
Yes.
Investment, trade, technology, Chinese tourists visiting Japan, vice versa. I think perhaps there is a cue there for India, meaning that our engagement with China should not be on this one NSG issue. Tomorrow, I'm sure, when the NSG meets, perhaps in your own studio, we'll all be discussing China and whether or not China is going to support India on NSG. So I think that is where the India-Japan becomes, to my mind, very, very
China
important.
is so crucial in everything that happens as far as India and Japan are concerned that we'll have to bring up China in this particular discussion as well. And Mr. Prem Shankar, I want to come to you and talk to you about that aspect of it. You know, Commodore was speaking about a different track and he was also talking about China. So let's talk about tracks now and talk about the bullet train, because Japan seems to have beaten China as far as, you know, agreements with the bullet trains are concerned.
Yes, I noticed that the first bullet train is going to be Bombay to Ahmedabad. It's going to cost 96,000 crores, of which the Japanese are going to give us 52,000 crores, I presume, as some kind of a low-interest loan. But I also made a calculation and found that at 96,000 crores, it is completely impossible for this train ever to even remotely come close to meeting its costs. Even if you ran it at full capacity, as is intended to be done, every 2 hours in both directions, it would not come even close to it. My real problem is that once you get caught up with a system like this, you're then locked into it for the rest of your grid, because these things don't change very easily. And a friend in China warned me about this, and he said, I don't know why your country is doing this, because we would have been able to do this for you at half this cost. And that's very true. And the Chinese trains are outstanding, as Ambassador Menon doubtless knows, and I have been on them, I also know. And I don't see, the Japanese trains have certain advantages when on taking high-speed curves, but we don't have that problem in India at all, any more than the Chinese do. So one doesn't have to spend the huge amounts of extra money that the Japanese spend in making that possible in their bullet trains. This is just a technicality I wanted to mention because I know about it. But that more broadly than this, this idea that it's China or Japan or the US or China, the either or zero-sum game mentality that we have, I think is completely out of date today. The Japanese, exactly as Uday Bhaskar said, don't think of their relations with China that way, and we shouldn't either. I don't think that we should make either the NSG or, for that matter, Masood Azhar, a kind of a sort of a litmus test of our relationship with the biggest single country in the world and potentially the biggest investor in India.
Indeed. Professor B.R. Deepak, you know, the media in China has been very closely watching this particular visit of Prime Minister Modi to Tokyo, and China too gave out a statement before Prime Minister Modi reached Tokyo saying that India and Japan should consider you know, the aspirations of its neighbors.
Right, you know, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think China remains, you know, an important factor when we are discussing relationship with Japan or even US, whether in the region or beyond. I think this is primarily, one is the geopolitical architecture, the global and the regional, so they are under drastic change. And primarily, I think with Japan and India, it is because these changes in the regional as well as global political architecture that are driving both the countries closer to each other. And of course, the chemistry between Prime Minister Modi and Shinzo Abe is another factor. Having said that, I think as far as China factor in this India-Japan relationship is concerned, I believe China is very, very watchful of India-Japan relationship, and that's why China has been retreating. And many people have personally, admitted to me that why India should be patching up with Japan for its UNSC, membership. And that would be extremely difficult for China to support. And this, remains one of the question. As far as economic engagement is concerned, I think there is a huge opportunity there for India and Japan, because if we see the Japanese ODA and investment policies during the 70s and 80s, especially 80s onward, early 80s onward, the pattern which Japan followed vis-a-vis these Asian tigers and then China. Now it is being replicated in India, and Prime Minister Modi is advocating the Make in India campaign in Japan, whether it is inviting Japanese investment in India. And we have seen that the Japanese companies, the registered companies so far in India, so they have increased to 1,200, and the investment has also accumulated investment over the period from 2008 to 2016. It has increased manifold, so around $20 billion US. So, which is huge. And last year, if you remember that our Trade and Commerce Minister, so they had an agreement with Japan, would like to double this investment over the next 5 years. That is by 2019, we will see the Japanese investment, direct investment in India, doubling. So I think these are extremely encouraging indicators, and especially the defense part of it, the civil nuclear deal. At one point in time, Japan and China and even US, they clubbed together in the wake of 1998 nuclear explosions in India. In fact, this deal now, it would enable the U.S. company as well as Japanese companies. Japanese companies have a lot of stakes in U.S. You say the Westinghouse Electrical Corporation and GE Astra companies will enable these companies to do business in India, and
right.
And then we hope that the cooperation on 6 nuclear reactor, it will start very soon. So I think it opens a plethora of other possibilities for India and Japan in various fields. So not only in economics, but defense and technology, and as Commodore Bhaskar said, that it is not meant to corner China. It is nothing like that. I think we need to engage Japan as much as we are engaging China. And NSG issue, as well as I think the issue of terrorism, it should not be holding our relationship hostage. I think this goes beyond
Professor Deepak, I want to take the discussion forward. Ambassador, Professor Deepak was talking about global architecture. There has been a major change in global architecture. We saw Donald Trump winning the elections on Tuesday. He's openly said that Japan has to take care of itself in the region. So, considering all of that, do you believe that things are going to change now? And it is, up to Japan to look out for itself?
Look, I think it's far too early to make policy based on what this mind-boggling result of the US elections is. I mean, Donald Trump has talked the talk. We'll have to see whether he walks the walk. On the one hand, he cannot move away from all that is promised to his constituency, and therefore, if he completely walks away from that, based on the realities of global politics, he's going to pay the price. On the other hand, there's no US president who can do whatever he likes. It's not as though he's the dictator of the big man, as the Africans say, of the United States. So we'll just have to wait and see. Certainly, if he moves ahead even in some form towards what he said about making allies pay for America supporting their defense, the American security umbrella that is provided to South Korea, to China, to Japan, and so on, there's going to be an extremely fragile situation in Asia, in the South China Sea, and the equations with China. So that, as I said, is something I think it's too early to just speculate on, but we have to, of course, factor that in. But on the global architecture business, I broadly agree with them. Look, the relationship within Asia and globally between India and Japan is an extremely important one for India. It is an important one for the region, Southeast Asia, as well as for Asia as a whole, and therefore for the globe. I am in the happy position of, I think, broadly agreeing with all three of our panelists. I think Uday was absolutely right in underlining that the nuclear deal, which you talked about, is actually something, apart from its own importance, it's something that removes a certain, it removes the constraints that were preventing us from moving ahead in lots of other fields in which we should collaborate with Japan. Because things seem to be, the trust factor, the movement ahead seemed to be sort of held in thrall depending on this agreement. And of course, I have this habit of agreeing with Prem Shankar Jha, and this time is no exception. I think there are a whole lot of things on the economic front, as the professor pointed out, that we should be concentrating on instead of the, one of the things that I, at least, am never in agreement with is this tunnel vision that selects one aspect of a visit and concentrates on that to the exclusion of everything else. The nuclear deal is a very good thing, but it is not everything in connection with our relationship with Japan. We have a host of things we can do with Japan. If you look at just the lifeblood of our economy, which is our small and medium enterprises, I wonder how many people know that the most successful, the biggest Japanese corporations are a conglomeration of small and medium enterprises. And that is something we can, we can incorporate in our economy with far, far better effect than the 96,000 crore bullet train which Prem referred to.
Indeed. Commodore, we saw that India, Japan and the US held drills in the Western Pacific a few months ago. China watched that very closely. It was very upset with what is happening. It said, that you shouldn't go ahead and do this because it's going to have larger implications. Are we going to see more of that going forward, or are we going to see less of that, and hence Japan has to look out for itself?
Well, I think, Frank, this is where I'll bring back the Trump factor, since you introduced it in the course of our discussion. I think what happens between India and Japan militarily, you referred to the naval exercise that we did recently, and there are, as I said, some other countries with which India has a military exercise relationship. I think the degree to which these exercises will be taken forward and whether they become more content-laden is going to depend on what kind of a policy President Trump is going to outline in relation to East Asia. Because the entire second phase of the Obama administration was about the pivot to Asia. Now, we know the kind of concern it had generated in China and what it did as far as East Asia is concerned, in which we also bring in the South China Sea. Now, in the event, I'm just giving you a hypothetical kind of situation, President Trump, after Jan 2017, says that we are now going to follow a more isolationist policy. And as far as East Asia is concerned, you're on your own. Washington proposes to improve its relationship with Moscow. So that's the main, shall we say, bilateral as far as United States is concerned. And Japan, South Korea, etc., you're on your own. In which case, I think Japan would not only have to revisit its constitution, but it would perhaps have to also review its bilateral, both with China and with other major Asian countries.
Indeed.
So that is the space India would then have to identify and decide as to how it wants to really, I think, move forward across the board. Not just the military, but the political, the economic, the military, and the technological aspects. Now, there are many areas, I think, where India and Japan can still continue to exercise, even in the limited naval domain. For instance, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief is like motherhood and apple pie. And India, I think, can benefit considerably from Japan, particularly in terms of technology. Now, for instance, on Prime Minister Modi's visit, we are talking about this aircraft, the US-2.
Yes.
It's an amphibious plane. It has certain capabilities. Now, it could be, again, symbolic of a whole area where India and Japan are able to perhaps produce, design, and bring to the table certain products that could be given to the rest of Asia. Not necessarily for combat, for military, but whether we talk about humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, maritime surveillance, there are a range of issues which are below the median in terms of getting China's concerns in any way sort of stoked or heightened. So I think my sense is that the degree to which India and Japan decide to now engage militarily will depend on the kind of path that the US, Russia, US, East Asia, US, China are likely to take. And India should be nimble, meaning that this is not a case that don't engage with Japan. By all means, engage with Japan, because Japan has got a lot of, I would say, strengths. For instance, satellites. You know, when we talk about the maritime domain, surveillance is a very, very big issue. And Japan can bring capacity, which again, I would say can be used in a fruitful way for the equivalent of the common good. So that is what I would identify. But if on the other hand, you have a worst case scenario where India and Japan, I think it was Shiv who said this point about if the need arises, then also I think we should be looking at options where India and Japan have to sort of engage militarily. I hope that exigency doesn't arise, but national policy has to be as objective as possible when we talk about bilaterals.
Indeed, indeed, it has to be so. But Mr. Jha, you know, as far as Prime Minister Modi's visit to Japan is concerned, do you believe that we have missed something, or do you believe that all the aspects thus far have been covered?
Very difficult for me to say. You know, I'm not an expert on India-Japan relations. I think that the very important thing that Uday has just said is to me very important, is the fact that the deal has broken a barrier which will allow superb technology, you know, which would previously have been considered dual-use technology and not given to us, to come from Japan to us. And some of the areas in which I think that is really important is actually to do with energy, because Japanese research on renewable energy is absolutely, you know, second to none. I look forward to that kind of cooperation. Secondly, I mean, let me take the whole question of how Trump will behave. Trump is speaking for a vast section of American public. He's not crazy. Just don't believe the media. The fact that the entire establishment there was against him does not make him crazy. This is the country which has won every battle. First of all, Cold War ended. It was supposed to bring peace. It brought war, unending war to America. Second, in those wars, America won every battle but lost every war, and went from a budget deficit, a national debt of $5 trillion to $19 trillion, and today has to beg the Congress every time it wants to spend a little more money. Its capacity for war is finished. People do not want war. We are really tired of it, and that's what Trump is reflecting. I do not see any way for Trump to do anything except to say, look, let's reassess our relationship with both Russia and China and see whether we really are enemies or not. We are, after all, in an interdependent world. We're China's biggest buyer. China is our biggest creditor. How on earth can we then have 400 military installations of one kind or another from Japan till Australia around China? This the pivot to Asia, if it is really a pivot to China, and it's not even an economic pivot, it's a military pivot.
Indeed.
It makes absolutely no sense except in terms of the arms sold by the military industrial complex.
Indeed, that's
we must be very wary of that. We must make sure we must make sure that wherever we get involved, it is in our national interest, not in some other country's national interest.
That's a very important observation. Yes, we have to look out for ourselves first, but we have come to the end of the program at the moment. I'll just take a final comment from Professor Deepak before I close the show. Professor Deepak, closing comments from you.
I think irrespective of Trump's pivot to Asia, or Trump asking Korea or Japan to pay for themselves, India and Japan and India and China is going to be the most defining relationship of this century, primarily because US, if we see the figures, is really declining. If you see the number of aircraft carrier, the Americans they possess, so they were 15, but now they come down to 11. And the same with the situation with their other heavy ships and nuclear submarine. And if you see the Chinese, so they are on the move. Their nuclear submarines they have increased to number 10, and the heavy ships also. And I think in this context, Japan and China, including India and Japan, they would be looking for this strategic space in Asia Pacific. And I think that space is sort of like the new arena for where that would define India and Japan's security relationship, and that would be, I think, supported by the increased economic collaboration in future. And the same thing is going to happen, at least in the economic front, with China, if not at security front.
Well, let's hope that happens. That's all the time we have on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for being with me on the show today and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for watching. See you again next time.